Welcome to this Rock and Talk webinar on corrosion and electrochemistry of steel in concrete. My name is Ueli Angst from the Durability of Engineering Materials Research Laboratory at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. Today, I'm going to show you a couple of topics all related to corrosion of steel in concrete. First of all, I would like to give a brief reminder and overview of the socio-economic impact of corrosion of steel in concrete. After that, we are going to look into the fundamentals of corrosion of steel in concrete very briefly. And then I would like to speak first about chloride-induced corrosion, and in particular, the role of the steel-concrete interface. And secondly, I would like to speak about corrosion in carbonation exposure environments. And also there, we will focus on the steel-concrete interface. I will then conclude with some highlights and further research opportunities. So let me start with the socio-economic impact of corrosion of steel in concrete. First, it has a financial impact. Corrosion was well demonstrated in the 1990s in a large US study that was initiated by NICE and then mandated by the US Congress. And in that very large study, it was also looked into the costs that are related to corrosion of highway bridges. It was concluded that the amount, $8.3 billion each year, which are the direct costs related to corrosion in highway bridges, are approximately equal to 0.1% of the gross domestic product. Now, 30 years later, we have again looked into this topic in Switzerland, and we have done a study focusing on the road bridges in Switzerland. I'm not going into the details of this study here. If you are interested, you can look it up. The reference is given here on the bottom of the slide. But what we came to the conclusion of that study is that we have a very similar figure still today in Switzerland here, 2020. The direct costs related to corrosion in Swiss road bridges is roughly 0.08% of the gross domestic product, which is a very comparable number to the one of the US from the 1990s. Now, the problem is it causes a lot of costs already today, but the problem is that infrastructure in the industrialized countries is continuously aging. And roughly today, the fraction of bridges that are more than 50 years old is 40 to 50% in most industrialized countries. And within the next 20 years, we expect that this figure will rise to around 70 to 80%. So that means that by large, the majority of the structures within the next coming 20 years will exceed the age of 50 years. And that simply means that there is an expected wave of need for replacement or at least heavy maintenance of all those bridges. This, of course, poses a challenge to the budgets and to the technology that we are using today in order to inspect and maintain those bridges. Now, apart from the economic impact and the safety associated with aging infrastructures, of course, infrastructure also has a societal relevance in terms of environmental and sustainability aspects. And here I would like to refer to the Rock and Talk webinar that was given by Professor Karen Scrivener a couple of weeks ago on cement and CO2, the reality. So in a nutshell, in that webinar, it was stated that the composition of the earth limits possible compositions for cements on the large scale. So that means that Portland cement remains the best option as a basis. Great potential to lower CO2 emissions is by increasingly using different supplementary cementitious materials. This ultimately leads to a reduction of the so-called clinker factor in cements, and that again means that we eliminate or at least decrease considerably the amount of calcium hydroxide in the cement. Now, it is important to recognize that in the 1970s and 80s, the scientific understanding about what protects protects steel against corrosion in concrete, both in chloride and carbonation exposure environments, that scientific understanding is significantly related to the presence of calcium hydroxide. So the question really is today, are attempts to decarbonize cement probably in conflict with attempts to ensure the durability of those concrete structures, at least when they are reinforced with carbon steel? So the answer to that question is no, but in order to still ensure the durability and be efficient in decarbonizing the construction sector, we potentially need a paradigm change. Let me very briefly review corrosion fundamentals, in particular for corrosion of steel in concrete. As probably all of you know, concrete is a very alkaline material with a pH above 12 typically, or at least Portland cement-based concretes. And in that environment, the steel is thermodynamically stable. The Pourbaix diagram here on the right shows that we can form a passive film on the steel in this highly alkaline environment, which then protects the steel from corrosion. Now, the problem is that if we have carbonation of the concrete, the CO2 of the environment will react with the concrete and will carbonate the concrete. This is a relatively slow progress, which over time, years and decades, then will reach the steel so that the pH here at the level of the steel can drop down to pH values around 8 or 9 or so. Now, once this concrete surface gets wet, we also get moisture penetrating to the steel, and that is what ultimately can trigger corrosion of steel in carbonated concrete. So basically we have only active corrosion during wet periods. In that case, the corrosion mechanism is of a uniform or close to uniform morphology or mechanism, where the cathodic reactions, here shown in blue, and the anodic reactions, shown in red, are uniformly distributed over the steel surface. And both these reactions occur at the same rate, and that rate is then the so-called microcell or uniform corrosion rate. And typically, we have moderate rates of metal loss in carbonation-induced corrosion. I will get back to this, and is in particular to the role of moisture later on during this presentation. Now, the result of carbonation-induced corrosion is that we precipitate corrosion products in the near field of the steel. So these yellow circles here represent precipitated corrosion products in the pore system around the steel, and that may ultimately lead to expansive stresses and then to cracking of the concrete cover. Now, chloride-induced corrosion is somewhat different from carbonation-induced corrosion. The source here, or the aggressive environmental species, is not CO2, but in that case it's chlorides, which could come from de-icing salts on roads or from seawater. Then splash water may bring these chlorides to the concrete surface, and there, over time, these chlorides will penetrate the concrete cover and then may reach the steel in quantity that is sufficient to trigger corrosion at a certain point in time. Now, the mechanism in that case is not uniform any longer, but it's a relatively localized corrosion attack here, where we form a local anode and then relatively large cathodic areas surrounding the anodes. And then we can see that we get a so-called macrocell formed with an electrolytic macrocell current flowing through the concrete here from the anodes towards the cathodes. And important to recognize here is that the anodic reaction is confined to the area of the local anode, while the cathodic reaction can occur on a relatively large surface area. And since the sum of those two reactions needs to be balanced, we can have a very high local current density. Remember, the current density is the current divided by the area. So this relatively high anodic current densities translate into very relatively high local metal losses or local corrosion rates. In that case, they can be up to 1 millimeter per year under extreme conditions. Now, I'm not going into any further details about the corrosion fundamentals here. If you are interested, of course, there are lots of textbooks that summarize all these topics, but we also provided short videos recently, which you can see on our YouTube channel, ETH Corrosion. And if you want to access that channel, you can use the QR code here on the right side in this slide. I would now like to move on to talk about chloride-induced corrosion, and in particular, the role of the steel-concrete interface. For that, let me briefly review how chloride-induced corrosion is generally understood in the literature and in all or virtually all scientific approaches. We consider that the chloride concentration at the steel surface, which is the blue curve here, increases over time. And at some point, conceptually, if this chloride concentration exceeds a certain threshold value, then we assume that we can get corrosion. Now, this threshold value is typically called chloride threshold value or simply critical chloride content or CCRIT. And I would like to briefly show you some data on this chloride threshold value from the literature. This is from a study done more than 10 years ago. But you can see that already at that time, if we look at all the literature studies reporting these chloride threshold values in the literature, there is a huge scatter. For Portland cement only, we have a scatter ranging from virtually 0 to 3% chloride related to the cement weight, which is in some cases, under some conditions in these studies, the chloride threshold value. And of course, if we have such a huge scatter here, in terms of this threshold value, you can imagine that it becomes very challenging to apply this concept to make realistic and reliable predictions in engineering practice. Also, this large scatter here somehow suggests that the concept is not based on sound science, because apparently there may be many other parameters that play a role in triggering corrosion of steel and concrete rather than only the chloride concentration. Now, this has a lot to do with the conditions at the steel-concrete interface, and I would like to show you a couple of results that emerged from the work of a Rilem technical committee, which is Technical Committee 262 SCI, and SCI here stands for steel-concrete interface. In that committee, we systematically looked at the steel-concrete interface and all the different heterogeneities that can occur at this interfacial zone. On the one hand, we have factors that are related to the steel side of the steel-concrete interface, which is, for instance, the metallurgy of the metal, but could also be initial rust or mill scale or other corrosion products or rust scales that are on the surface. On the other hand, we have the so-called concrete part of the steel-concrete interface, which can also have a lot of heterogeneities, such as bleed water zones or air voids and concrete splatter and cracks and so forth. And all these macroscopic voids, such as bleed water zones and settlement zones and voids and so on, they could be in different moisture states. For instance, they could be largely air-filled, they could be partially saturated with water or completely saturated with water. And all these different moisture states, of course, would have an influence on the local susceptibility of the metal here to corrosion. Now, by reviewing the literature and attempting to rank the individual relevance of different features of the steel-concrete interface or properties of these systems, this is what we concluded with. You can see that those factors that are at the top of this graph are the ones that literature suggests would have the strongest influence on triggering or determining the susceptibility of steel to chloride-induced corrosion in concrete. So we can say that factors that are related actually to the steel, and here we are basically talking about carbon steel, and no high alloyed steel and no galvanized steel and none of these. So even for just pure carbon steel, factors that are related to the metal have a dramatic impact on the chloride threshold value or on corrosion initiation of steel and concrete in general. The second most influence is the moisture, and I will get back to that later. And then factors that are related more to the concrete, the properties of the concrete, don't seem to be that important. Now, let me show you a couple of examples here, and I would like to start with steel metallurgy. This is an example from tests that were performed with different rebars immersed in a electrolyte with variable chloride to hydroxyl ion ratio. And you could see that the metallurgy of the metal of the rebar seems to have a dramatic impact on the chloride threshold value. So from these laboratory tests, it was concluded that martensitic rebars, or at least rebars with an outer layer of tempered martensite, have a lower chloride threshold value than ferritic perlitic microstructures. From a study where samples from structures were analyzed, a similar conclusion could be drawn. Also here, those rebars in the structures that were of ferritic perlitic type of steel generally had a higher chloride threshold value compared to the tempered martensitic steels. Another influencing factor that is relevant are the moisture conditions. And here I would like to show you some recent results from a laboratory study where identical concrete specimens with reinforcing steel inside were exposed to different moisture conditions. And then the chloride threshold value was measured by stopping the experiments once corrosion started, and at that point measuring the chloride concentration in the concrete. Now, one series of these samples was exposed in a constant exposure regime, which means that the samples were just placed down in sodium chloride solution. The relative humidity at the depth in the concrete at the depth of the steel was roughly 98%, which was measured by embedded relative humidity sensors. The other series of samples was exposed to cyclic wetting and drying, and in that case, the average relative humidity at the rebar depth was a bit lower, namely 95%. And you can see that the chloride threshold values that were found from these two different series of exposure conditions, again, by exposing the same type of samples, were considerably different. Let me say one more word on this. It is generally assumed that this has something to do with the presence of moisture in the concrete, but I would like to mention here that even under these constantly immersed conditions here, the potentials, the electrochemical potentials of the steel indicated no oxygen depletion over the experimental time, which was several months, but suggested that we have still enough oxygen here in that case, and compared similar oxygen concentrations, at least between those two series of tests. Now, the role of moisture in interfacial voids, we were hypothesizing about that in the Rilem Technical Committee 262/SCI. And as you can see from these schematic sketches, there seems to be, of course, an influence whether or not these macroscopic interfacial voids are filled with water, partially filled with water, or completely filled with air. So in the first case, if they are water saturated and if the void is directly at the steel surface, it would be reasonable to assume that we can trigger corrosion here under these conditions, because the calcium hydroxide phases that can buffer locally the pH here would be relatively remote. So there is a certain distance from these cementitious phases here to buffer the pH at the steel surface. And of course, the absence of the local buffer capacity here would allow for corrosion to initiate more easily. In the other cases here, where especially in that case where the air void is filled with air and only maybe an adsorbed water layer is present on the steel surface, it is unreasonable to believe that there can be a strong macro cell type of corrosion established under these conditions, because the electrical resistivity for the electrolytic current to flow in this very thin layer of adsorbed water is relatively high. However, in that case, we have a large reservoir of oxygen present in the void, and that could, of course, sustain the corrosion to happen nearby. And in the case where we have a partially saturated void, one could assume that corrosion would initiate in the part of the void that is filled with liquid water, while the oxygen reservoir here could sustain the pit growth in the early stage and therefore also promote corrosion initiation. There is also a case which typically can also occur where we have a thin cement paste layer separating the steel and interfacial voids. And in that case, of course, we have a somewhat different situation because this cement paste layer here may retain a lot of water in case of partially saturated voids. And at the same time, we have a very nearby reservoir of oxygen that could facilitate chloride-induced corrosion initiation in that case. Now, I have to emphasize that these are all currently hypotheses, and there is certainly more research needed in order to elucidate clearly the role of interfacial voids in corrosion initiation in concrete. However, one consequence of the heterogeneity of the steel-concrete interface is that there is a size effect in corrosion. This can be observed when different samples with different sizes are studied, because in that case, it can be observed that the chloride threshold value significantly depends on the size of the sample. So the longer the exposed rebar or the larger the exposed surface area of the rebar that is exposed to chlorides, the lower becomes the chloride threshold value. And of course, that finding has direct implications for service life modeling, for structural engineering, for condition assessment, and so forth, because the critical question that comes up in that case here is, which size do we have to use in service life modeling? To answer these questions, there is certainly a need to link chloride-induced corrosion to structural engineering, because the dimensions of a structural member and the distributions of stresses and loads within that structural member play a role in deciding on the size that needs to be considered in service life modeling or in condition assessment. After having reviewed briefly the state-of-the-art of chloride-induced corrosion in concrete, I would like to move on to carbonation-induced corrosion in concrete. Now, as I have already shown earlier, what is critical or what is really important to get corrosion going in carbonated concrete is that we need a relatively high water content at the steel-concrete interface. What you can see here on this slide are all data from the literature where instantaneous corrosion rates have been collected or reported in different studies. And you can see that if we group these different studies according to the moisture states that were used, you can see a general trend of increasing instantaneous corrosion rates if we increase the moisture content. And you can get the highest corrosion rates if the sample is, of course, in contact with liquid water. But as I said initially, even under these conditions, the average corrosion rates are of the order of 10 micrometer per year, sometimes lower and sometimes a bit higher. The other thing that I would like to highlight is this relatively large scatter here in the literature data, which of course can be attributed due to different conditions, such as different concrete types, different pore solution chemistries, maybe also different measurement methods. Now, if we look at studies where the moisture content was changed within a consistent type of specimens or within one type of specimen, then you can see that the scatter gets a lot lower, of course, within these studies or even among these studies. And again, there is a dramatic increase in corrosion rate when increasing the moisture concentration. In fact, this curve is not linear here, but it has some sort of an exponential behavior. Now, to understand scientifically the effect of the moisture state on the corrosion rate, we have to consider an important difference between testing corrosion of steel in an electrolyte, in a bulk solution, and testing that same metal in a porous medium and then changing the moisture condition. So already a long time ago, from Japan, there was a study showing that steel would corrode in carbonated concrete because when testing steel in a solution and when decreasing the pH, of course, the potential of that steel would go down, which indicates that the steel would corrode. Now, if the same steel is in concrete with also a low pH, it doesn't necessarily mean that the steel would corrode, because for the corrosion, we do not only need a low pH, we also need the presence of liquid water or moisture at the steel surface. Now, there is a dual influence of the pore structure in this, because on the one hand, the pore structure plays a role, of course, on how the moisture is retained in the system. And on the other hand, the pore structure affects how ferrous ions that are released in the corrosion reactions can move away from the metal. And the easier it is for these ferrous ions to move away from the metal, the easier it is for the corrosion reaction to go on. This can be described by well-established electrochemical theory, such as the dependency of the reversible potential of the iron-iron 2 electrode on the iron 2 concentration at the metal surface. And that can then explain why the effective corrosion rate here in those parts of the metal that are in contact with a low pH solution is depending on the pore structure or on the transport of ferrous ions in that pore structure. On the other hand, the pore structure also has an influence because, as I said initially, it determines how much moisture can be retained in the pore system. So together with the moisture exposure conditions, we can explain how much of the steel surface actually is in contact with liquid water, because if we are below saturation, some of the pores will be filled with air, and those zones are the zones where the steel is at best in contact with an adsorbed layer of water, which, as I said earlier, does not really allow for efficient or at least for fast corrosion reactions to occur. The reason is, again, this thin layer of water will be relatively quickly saturated with iron 2. Now, overall, these two branches here of this theory allow us to explain the corrosion current density, the apparent corrosion current density, which is macroscopically measurable. We can also explain this or quantify this effect by using the theory of capillary condensation, where essentially we can relate the stably filled pores or their radius to the relative humidity. And depending on the pore size distribution, of course, that allows us to estimate the so-called electrochemically active area fraction, which is that fraction of the steel which is in contact with an electrolyte and with liquid water. Now, if I summarize the influencing factors at the structural level, and this is a figure from another Rilem committee, which is committee 281 CCC, working group 5. From that figure, you can see that the most important influencing factors in determining the corrosion rate of steel in carbonated concrete are the exposure climate, the cover depth, and the pore structure. Let me briefly explain the relationships here. So the exposure climate defines how much moisture we get to the concrete surface, for instance, due to rain events and so on. Then the pore structure and the cover depth both have an influence on how fast this moisture can be transported through the cover depth and reach the steel. And then, of course, the amount of moisture and the duration during which we get that moisture to the steel influence how much corrosion we can get. So whenever we have a high moisture content at the steel concrete interface, we can get high instantaneous corrosion rates, but if that only occurs very rarely or during very limited time, it will not create much damage. So the integration of the instantaneous corrosion rate over time is relevant for the damage or the cracking and spalling that will occur at the structural level. Now, I would like to emphasize again that the scientific understanding of the mechanism that to explain what protects steel from corroding in concrete, was heavily attributed to the presence of calcium hydroxide. Now, today, we have shifted a bit the scientific understanding from the role of calcium hydroxide towards the role of moisture and microstructure at the steel-concrete interface. And I think, referring back to my introduction, this is what brings new opportunities for blended low-carbon cements. If we stick to the fact, and probably we should mention that most engineering concepts heavily rely on the presence of calcium hydroxide, and if we stick to that concept, then we have a problem, because as long as we remove calcium hydroxide from the concrete when producing low-carbon cements, then we are in trouble. However, if we shift our focus towards the role of moisture and microstructure, then we could design the system in a different way, so that we can actually control the moisture transport through the steel, through the cover depth, instead of controlling CO2 transport and transport of the carbonation front through the cover depth and towards the steel only. And I think that opens new opportunities for the decarbonization of the cement industry. Now, to conclude, the first point that I would like to make is that we have seen that the steel-concrete interface significantly impacts the corrosion of steel in concrete, and that both in chloride-induced and in carbonation-induced corrosion. The factors that are of predominant importance are the interfacial concrete microstructure, the moisture content at the interface, and the metallurgy of the steel. Now, there are research opportunities, and I think it is important to tackle these in order to take advantage of new concepts. And on the one hand, there is a need for a better understanding of the effect of the rebar metallurgy. These 2 or 3 studies that I highlighted initially that indicate that the metallurgy is important are not very systematic studies, and I think there is a need for more systematic work to look into this factor. Secondly, the effect of moisture at the steel-concrete interface is not yet well understood, and in particular, we should take advantage of progress that was made in modeling the moisture transport through the concrete cover and couple that to the corrosion mechanism or to the corrosion processes at the steel surface. I mentioned that there is a size effect in chloride-induced corrosion, and of course, for service life modeling, it is crucial to know which size to take, because the size that you take into consideration significantly impacts the chloride threshold value. So for that, I think we need to put more focus on studies where corrosion science is linked to structural engineering and structural considerations. And finally, if we allow us to better understand all these factors, I think we could generate large new opportunities for sustainable construction and decarbonizing the concrete industry. With that, I am at the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention.